On the night of August 24th, 1995, people stood outside computer stores waiting for midnight. They were not lining up for a new game console or a revolutionary machine. Many of them already owned the hardware. They were waiting to buy a box of software with a cloudy blue sky on the front. Across the United States, stores opened their doors in the middle of the night. The Empire State Building was illuminated in the colours of the Windows logo. Television advertisements used the Rolling Stones song "Start Me Up." Microsoft turned an operating system upgrade into the kind of cultural event normally reserved for a blockbuster film, and somehow it worked. Windows 95 sold 7 million copies in its first 5 weeks. Within a year, Microsoft said 40 million copies had shipped. But those numbers do not explain why it became a dividing line in the history of the personal computer. Before Windows 95, millions of people already used PCs. After Windows 95, the PC began to feel like something different. A familiar place where ordinary people could work, play, explore, and connect to the world. So what did Windows 95 actually change? And why does a system remembered for crashes and endless restarts still define the way we use computers today? The answer begins with how awkward the typical PC could be before it arrived. By the early 1990s, the IBM compatible computer had become an enormously successful platform. Businesses used it for spreadsheets and databases. Families were buying machines for homework, games, and the growing world of multimedia. But owning one still required a certain tolerance for friction. The machine often began at an MS-DOS command prompt. To start a program, users might have to remember a drive letter, find the correct directory, and type a command precisely. Windows 3.1 placed a graphical environment on top, but its Program Manager organized applications into groups of icons, while File Manager handled disks and folders somewhere else. The system worked, but it did not always feel like one coherent world. Adding hardware could be worse. A new sound card, modem, printer, or CD-ROM drive might require drivers, configuration files, interrupt settings, and patience. A mistake could leave the new device unusable or stop another one from working. The PC offered remarkable freedom, but users often paid for that freedom by becoming part-time technicians. Microsoft faced a difficult problem. It needed to make the PC easier and more modern, yet it could not simply erase the past. Millions of customers depended on DOS programs, older Windows applications, games, printers, and expansion cards. A technically perfect system that rejected that library would have been a commercial disaster. Microsoft needed to move forward without making yesterday's computer obsolete. The project created to solve that problem was codenamed Chicago. Chicago was not designed as a clean break. It was designed as a bridge. Windows 95 still used MS-DOS during startup and preserved pieces of the 16-bit world. Beneath the marketing, it was a complicated mixture of old and new technology. But that compromise was also its greatest strength. Windows 95 gave new 32-bit applications a more capable environment, including preemptive multitasking. The system could divide processor time between those programs, instead of waiting for each one to surrender control. It introduced long file names, instead of the old 8-character DOS format. Networking became a central feature rather than an exotic addition. It was not as clean or protected as Microsoft's more advanced Windows NT architecture. Old 16-bit software could still create trouble, and parts of the system remained vulnerable to one bad program. Yet Windows 95 did something more valuable. It allowed families and businesses to carry existing software into a more modern future. That balance between compatibility and progress would become one of Microsoft's most powerful advantages. But the technical changes were only half the revolution. The part users could see began in the lower left corner of the screen. For the first time, Windows opened onto a desktop organized around the Start button and taskbar. The word Start answered the most basic question a new user could ask. Where do I begin? Clicking it revealed programs, documents, settings, search tools, help, and even the command for shutting down. The design was simple enough to become a joke. Users had to click Start to stop the computer. But the logic was powerful. One reliable doorway could lead almost anywhere. The taskbar solved another problem. Open programs no longer seemed to disappear behind one another. Each running application had a visible place at the bottom of the screen. Users could move between tasks and understand, at a glance, what the computer was doing. Windows Explorer brought files, folders, disks, and network locations into a more consistent system. My computer made the hardware feel accessible. The recycle bin made deletion less frightening. Shortcuts allowed important programs and documents to live on the desktop. Right-click menus placed useful actions beside the object being used. None of these ideas existed in isolation. Graphical interfaces had been evolving for years, and competing computers already offered elegant desktops. Windows 95's achievement was to combine these ideas into a practical language and place it on an enormous variety of affordable PCs. If you remember that startup sound, subscribe to Pastware. We tell the stories hidden inside the technology you grew up with. Windows 95 also tried to change the relationship between the PC and its hardware. Microsoft promoted plug and play as a way for the computer to recognize devices and configure them automatically. The promise was that installing a peripheral would become an ordinary consumer task instead of a negotiation with manuals, switches, and mysterious system resources. Reality was less graceful. Older hardware had not been designed for the new system. Drivers varied wildly in quality, and conflicts did not disappear. Users soon created a less flattering nickname, plug and pray. But even when the feature failed, the expectation it created survived. After Windows 95, it became increasingly unacceptable for a new device to require expert knowledge. Hardware companies were pushed to provide drivers, follow common standards, and compete on ease of installation. The burden moved away from the owner and toward the industry. That shift helped transform computers into consumer products. The launch made that transformation impossible to miss. Microsoft surrounded Windows 95 with one of the software industry's most aggressive promotional campaigns. Jay Leno appeared at the official event. A video featured 2 stars from friends guiding viewers through the system. Brian Eno composed the brief startup sound. The campaign did more than advertise features. It told the public that personal computing had entered a new era, and that ordinary people were invited. For those who installed it at home, the experience was more intimate than the spectacle. There was the large cardboard box, there were floppy disks or a CD-ROM. There was the long setup process, the nervous restart, and then the clouds appeared. A short musical chord played, and a teal desktop waited behind the login screen. The machine still made mechanical noises, modems screamed while connecting, monitors were deep and heavy, software came in boxes thick enough to contain manuals. Yet the desktop made all of it feel connected. One evening the PC could be a word processor. The next it could run a game, browse an encyclopedia on CD-ROM, play music, organize photographs, or connect to an online service. Solitaire and Minesweeper sat beside serious business software. The computer no longer had one fixed identity. Windows gave it a stage on which different identities could appear. That mattered to developers as much as it mattered to users. Every platform faces the same circular problem. Customers want the most software, while developers want the most customers. Windows 95 turned that circle into a machine. Its rapidly growing audience encouraged software companies to target its 32-bit programming interfaces. More applications made Windows more valuable. More customers then bought Windows PCs, which attracted still more developers. Hardware manufacturers followed for the same reason. Supporting Windows was no longer merely useful. It was becoming the price of entering the mass PC market. Computer makers could still compete on processors, memory, storage, design, and price. But Windows made machines from different manufacturers feel familiar. A customer could move from a Compaq to a Dell or an IBM and still recognize the Start button, taskbar, folders, and applications. The hardware brand remained visible. The operating system increasingly defined the experience. Gaming revealed how far that change could reach. Before Windows 95, serious PC games often ran directly in DOS, because developers needed performance and close access to graphics, sound, and input hardware. But that meant dealing with a confusing range of configurations. A game might work with one sound card and fail with another. Microsoft introduced DirectX in 1995 to give developers a consistent path to multimedia hardware. Instead of writing unique code for every device, a studio could use common interfaces while Windows and its drivers handled more of the variation underneath. The transition was not immediate. DOS gaming did not disappear overnight, and early DirectX versions were imperfect. But the direction had changed. Windows was becoming not only the place where users launched games, but the platform on which major PC games were built. Graphics card makers, sound companies, computer manufacturers, and developers now had stronger incentives to move together. The modern Windows gaming ecosystem began to take shape. The internet produced an even larger consequence, although Windows 95 arrived before Microsoft fully understood what was coming. The original experience emphasized dial-up networking and Microsoft's own online service. The first Internet Explorer reached consumers through Microsoft Plus and early manufacturer installations rather than defining every retail copy at launch. As the web exploded, Microsoft realized that the desktop was more than an interface. It was the most valuable distribution point in personal computing. Whatever Microsoft placed on that desktop could reach millions. That power helped the company push rapidly into web browsing, and later place Microsoft at the center of a historic antitrust battle. Windows 95 had made the PC easier to enter, but it had also made one company the gatekeeper to many of those entrances. This was the darker side of standardization. The same consistency that helped users and developers also made it harder for rival operating systems to compete. A challenger did not merely need a better interface, it needed drivers, applications, manufacturer support, retail confidence, and a reason for customers to abandon software they already owned. Windows 95 strengthened every part of that barrier. The more dominant it became, the safer it seemed for developers to support it, and the safer it seemed, the more dominant it became. Yet calling Windows 95 flawless would misunderstand why it mattered. It crashed, drivers failed, blue screens became part of popular culture, plug and play sometimes demanded manual intervention, the hybrid architecture carried old limitations into the new interface. A badly behaved application could still freeze the experience, and many users learned that restarting the machine was not a final solution, but a routine maintenance procedure. Even the celebrated simplicity had limits. Menus grew crowded, settings could be difficult to find, the registry concentrated important configuration data in a place most ordinary users did not understand. The system made the PC friendlier, but it did not make computing effortless. What it did was change the standard by which effort was judged. Before Windows 95, users accepted that operating a PC required learning the machine's language. After Windows 95, the machine was expected to explain itself. Programs should be discoverable, open tasks should remain visible, deleted files should be recoverable, hardware should identify itself, different computers should behave in familiar ways. Those expectations outlived the operating system. Later versions of Windows replaced its code, improved its stability, transformed its appearance, and adapted to broadband, laptops, touchscreens, and cloud services. But the basic grammar remained recognizable. A desktop, a taskbar, a central menu, windows that minimize, maximize, and close, files represented as objects that can be moved, opened, and restored. Even Microsoft discovered how deeply that grammar had entered public memory when it removed the traditional Start menu years later and then brought it back. Windows 95 therefore changed the PC in two different ways. On the surface, it gave millions of people a clearer way to control their computers. Underneath, it aligned software developers, hardware manufacturers, and PC makers around one dominant platform. The first change made the PC approachable. The second made Windows extraordinarily difficult to displace. Its secret was not purity, it was translation. Windows 95 translated old software into a new era. It translated a complicated machine into visual objects. It translated technical freedom into something a mass audience could use. And it translated the PC from incompatible parts into a familiar consumer experience. That is why people lined up at midnight for software. They believed they were buying an upgrade. What they were really buying was a new idea of what a personal computer should be. Windows 95 did not invent every part of the modern desktop. It did something more consequential. It made that desktop the common language of the PC world. And once hundreds of millions of people learned that language, the personal computer would never feel the same again.